If I asked you to assess whether somebody could swim, would you give them an assessment task containing 20 questions about swimming? You might ask them about water safety, breathing techniques, what they should do if they get into difficulty. But at some point, you'd need to get them in the water and watch them swim, right? The written answers might be able to tell you what the person knows about swimming, but they couldn't tell you whether that person can coordinate their movements and control their breathing and respond when conditions change or get themselves safely to the edge of the pool. Now, that sounds really obvious when we talk about swimming, right? But across vet, we regularly try to assess practical performance, oral communication, problem solving, and professional judgment by asking learners to write about them. We then treat the completed assessment task as evidence that the learner can perform. If we choose the wrong method of measurement, though, the result can't possibly tell us what we think it does. Now, this video is part 2 of my 5-part series on what RTOs can actually do in response to AI-generated assessment submissions. If you haven't watched video 1, go back, watch video 1, and then come back to this video. Now, this isn't another series about AI detection software or catching students cheating or adding another declaration to an assessment task. Over these 5 videos, I want to help your RTO take back control of its assessment system. Too many RTOs have been led to believe that buying a mapped assessment resource means that somebody else has already done all the hard thinking for them. Increasingly, those resources are also being produced using AI, and some of what is being sold to the sector it's not good enough. So by the end of this series, you'll have a practical action plan for identifying your most vulnerable assessments and redesigning them so that they're more authentic, more accessible, and much better at measuring competence. You don't need an enormous budget, and you don't need to keep placing blind faith in commercial assessment resources. You need to understand what good assessment design looks like so that your RTO can make informed decisions about its own assessment system and properly evaluate anything it chooses to buy. So make sure that you don't miss the rest of this series by subscribing to the channel and turning on the notifications so that you know as soon as the next video is available. So let's get into it. Assessment is a form of measurement. Its purpose is to help an assessor determine whether the learner can perform to the standard required by the training product. That means the starting point for assessment design shouldn't be the number of questions you want to ask. It shouldn't be the template that the RTO used for another unit. It shouldn't be whatever format the resource provider decided would be the easiest to package and sell. The starting point should be a much more fundamental question. What are we actually trying to measure? Once we've answered that, we can ask what evidence would demonstrate the capability and which assessment method would allow the learner to produce that evidence. In other words, we need to begin with the competency, not the document. Now, every assessment method introduces its own demands. When we use an extended written response, we're not only measuring the learner's knowledge of the subject, We're also measuring their reading comprehension, their written expression, their vocabulary, their spelling, their ability to organize ideas, and their familiarity with formal assessment conventions. Now, some of those skills may well be relevant to the competency, but others may have been introduced purely because we chose to assess the learner through writing. So imagine two learners completing the same unit. The first learner writes confidently and produces a polished explanation of a workplace procedure, but they struggle to follow that procedure in practice. The second learner can perform the procedure safely and can explain their decisions during a conversation while they're demonstrating it. But they find it difficult to construct a formal written response. If the unit requires the person to perform the procedure rather than write a written response about it, which learners provided the stronger evidence of competence there? Too often, the first learner actually appears more capable because our assessment method rewards their writing. The second learner appears less capable because the assessments introduced a barrier that may have very little to do with the occupational skill. And this is the question every assessment designer needs to ask. Are we measuring the competency, or are we measuring the learner's ability to complete the format we selected? This is where foundation skills need to become a central part of the assessment design conversation. Reading, writing, oral communication, literacy, and digital skills are all embedded throughout vocational performance. The aim isn't to remove foundation skills from assessment or pretend that they don't matter. The question is whether the type and level of foundation skill demanded by the assessment are actually consistent with the competency and its workplace application. If a job requires somebody to complete a short workplace form, then it's entirely appropriate to ask the learner to complete one. If the person needs to read procedures, interpret measurements, or communicate with customers, well, those foundation skills need to be demonstrated. The problem occurs when assessment demands substantially more than the occupation and training product requires. A short workplace form becomes a lengthy written report. A conversation with a client becomes a written description of what the learner would say. A practical safety check becomes a series of essay-style questions about safety. The assessment has now added reading or writing demands that don't belong to the capability being measured. The learner's result is being influenced by something that the assessment designer introduced. This is particularly important when learners have diverse language, literacy, disability, educational, or communication backgrounds. If the additional demand isn't an essential part of the competency, then it distorts our measurement and it creates an unnecessary barrier for all of our learners. Now, this brings us to reasonable adjustment. Reasonable adjustment will always be necessary for some learners. Good assessment design can't anticipate or remove every individual barrier, and some learners will require adjustments that respond to their particular circumstances. However, I know without a shadow of a doubt that RTOs wouldn't need to make as many reactive adjustments if assessments were properly designed from the beginning. If an RTO repeatedly needs to explain a written task verbally, to simplify its instructions or to convert written questions into verbal questions, it shouldn't assume that every learner is the problem. It should be examining whether the assessment task was actually suitable in the first place. If the learner can demonstrate the required knowledge through targeted questioning connected to their performance, why did we automatically require an extended written response? If the unit requires interaction with another person, why are we asking the learner to write a description of an imaginary interaction? Sometimes we describe a change as reasonable adjustment when really what we're doing is repairing an unsuitable assessment one learner at a time. Better design won't eliminate reasonable adjustment, but it can reduce the number of barriers the RTO creates before the learner even begins. Now, the next problem is the way that we treat knowledge as though it's the same as competence. Now, knowledge is important, right? Learners need to understand relevant principles, procedures, risks, responsibilities, and the reasons behind their actions. However, knowing something doesn't mean that a person can use it. A learner may be able to list the steps in a procedure, but perform those steps in the wrong order. They may be able to describe active listening, but repeatedly interrupt another person. They may identify hazards in a written scenario, but fail to notice those same hazards in front of them. They may explain how to support a distressed person using all the correct terminology, but then freeze or become dismissive or respond inappropriately when somebody's genuinely distressed. Now, people often say, well, knowledge is power, right? Knowledge is only powerful when you can use it, right? And in competency-based assessment, knowing the answer isn't the same as being able to act on it. Knowledge without application is information. Competence requires the learner to do something with it. Now, this doesn't mean that we stop assessing knowledge. It means we stop treating the reproduction of knowledge as sufficient evidence that someone can actually apply it. Now, knowledge assessment becomes much more meaningful when it's connected to performance, to decisions, and to context. Instead of asking a learner to list 5 communication strategies, we could observe an interaction and then ask why they chose that particular approach. We could ask what they noticed about the other person's response and what they would have done differently if the situation changed. Instead of asking the learner to reproduce a safety procedure, we could ask them to actually carry out the procedure and then explain the risks that they're controlling at different points. We could introduce a realistic change and ask them to decide how they'd respond. The knowledge hasn't disappeared. We're still determining what the learner understands, but we're also examining whether they can recognize when that knowledge is relevant and use it appropriately. This form of questioning can also strengthen authenticity. A generic AI-generated response may describe best practice perfectly, but it can't explain why the learners made a specific decision during a performance that the assessors just observed, can it? The assessor can probe the relationship between what the learner knows, what they did, and why they did it. That provides much richer evidence than a paragraph just containing expected keywords used correctly. Application is also more than just repeating a rehearsed sequence. A learner may be able to perform a familiar task under predictable conditions, but struggle when something changes. Genuine competence usually involves recognizing relevant information, selecting an appropriate response, and adjusting when circumstances require that. This doesn't mean that assessments should be designed to catch learners out. The purpose isn't to introduce random obstacles or create a stressful test of confidence. The purpose is to establish whether the learner understands what they're doing well enough to use their capability beyond one memorized response. A small change to a scenario can actually reveal a great deal. The assessor might ask what the learner would do if a resource were unavailable, or if a client responded differently, or a risk increased, or the situation moved beyond their level of responsibility. The learner's response can show whether they understand the principles behind the task, whether they can recognize their limitations, and also if they know when to seek assistance. That's a much more meaningful use of knowledge than just reproducing a definition. This is also why a mapping document can't answer the measurement question for you. A resource provider may map a written question against a performance criterion because the wording of the question mentions the topic, and that's particularly an issue when they're using AI to do this. Now, that doesn't mean the response demonstrates the required performance. A question that asks a learner to explain how you would communicate doesn't assess the learner communicating. A question that asks the learner to describe how you would complete a task doesn't demonstrate that they can complete the task. The verbs matter, the context matters, the conditions matter, and the evidence the learner actually produces matters. RTOs need to look beyond whether a requirement appears somewhere in the mapping. They need to evaluate whether the selected method can measure the capability described by that requirement. You can outsource the development work, but you cannot outsource that judgment. Now, in the first video, I asked you to identify the assessments in your RTO that are most vulnerable to AI and other forms of substitution. Now, your second action is to select one of those tasks and create a simple measurement map. So to do this, start by writing down what the learner is currently asked to produce, right? It might be a written explanation, a completed template, a case study response, project. Next, identify what the task is supposed to measure. Is it measuring knowledge, practical performance, oral communication, problem solving, decision making, the ability to adapt? Now, in many cases, it will involve more than one of these. Your next step is then to identify everything the assessment format requires from the learner. Think about its reading, writing, numeracy, oral communication, and digital demands. And ask which of those demands are essential to the competency and which have been introduced by the assessment method. And finally, ask whether a successful response would actually give the assessor enough information to determine that the learner can perform the required skill. If the response only tells you that the learner can write about the skill, then you've identified a gap. Now, you don't need to redesign the assessment yet. For now, you're diagnosing whether the current method measures what the RTO believes it measures. Now, if an assessment is a measurement, the method must fit the capability. Otherwise, we risk making decisions about competence based on a learner's ability to produce the format we selected. That problem affects more than AI and plagiarism. It affects validity, accessibility, reasonable adjustment, and the quality of the qualification the RTO eventually issues. Your action from this video is to complete a measurement map for one vulnerable assessment task. Identify what it currently asks the learner to produce, what it's supposed to measure, and which additional foundation skill demands the format has introduced. In the next video, we're going to use that information to choose an assessment method that actually fits the skill. We'll look at when to use observation, demonstration, interaction, workplace products, and targeted questioning, rather than automatically reaching for another written task. So subscribe so you don't miss the next part of the series. And if this video has made you question what your assessments are really measuring, give it a like and share it with the people responsible for assessment design in your RTO. I'll see you in the next one.